And welcome everyone to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's episode is titled The War on Drugs Turns 50. I'm pleased to be joined by David Farber. He's the Roy A. Roberts Distinguished Professor of History at the University of Kansas. Today is April the 5th, 2022. Hey everybody, this is Andy Mink. I'm the Vice President of Education at the Center. On behalf of my staff, Jira, Mike, and Meredith, I want to welcome you back to our webinar series. I want to thank you again for such loyal and frequent attendance. I'm always amazed that many of you are here, it seems like every single week. And as our season is nearing a close, I'm going to, in some ways, regret not spending a Tuesday or a Thursday night with you having these kinds of conversations. In particular, as I look around the room tonight, I'd like to thank Amanda for being here. Amanda's joining us from Dayton, Ohio. Jennifer's here from Central New York. Candace from Crosslands High School, and Histara from Drew University. Thank all of you for being here. Davis, I see you in the room from Walton High School outside of Atlanta. And Kira and Peter are both here from Berendo Middle School. I hope that tonight's session, all of our webinars are meaningful if you're in the same department or perhaps teach on the same team. It's nice to see some colleagues here as well. As always, we have a lot of Los Angeles Unified folks in the room. One of these days, we're going to be able to somehow quantify that and be with you maybe face to face. Samuel, Angelic, Carla, Darlene, Veronica, thank you for representing Los Angeles, and please do spread the word. We appreciate you spending time with us. National Humanities Center is, much like you, starting to see the end of our academic calendar draw near. Our fellows are working furiously to take advantage of the last month and a half of their fellowship year with us. It's always interesting to me, though, when this time of year rolls around. First of all, North Carolina is covered in a green mist of pine pollen to the point where your shoes will track it into your house. You can't really leave your windows open because it'll filter through your screens and cover your porches, cover your furniture and then your porches. Allergies are not so good here this time of year. But it's always amazing to me when the fellows reach this part of their journey, of their research. Many of them have come in with a research idea that they've explored earnestly for the last 6 months. They've accessed our library services. They've gotten to know each other, often across disciplines and between universities. They've sort of eddied out from the daily grind of a working professional, really at any level. And this is the time where they start to reflect on the progress that they made, not because we have some kind of page limit that's due or some kind of checklist that they have to meet, but simply because they can feel that precious currency of time starting to slip away. I know as an educator, as a teacher, I always felt something similar in the classroom because you're getting to the point when, when you can see the end of the school year teaching in, even a disrupted one like this. You can start to measure the impact that you've had on your kids, the steps that they might take next, where you might wind up this summer and beyond. I do hope that the work that we have shared with you in the webinar series, and in particular tonight's session, also goes a long way to giving you confidence and giving you experience and giving you language for addressing some of those topics that aren't necessarily in the curriculum you teach or the standards that you're responsible for. I always find that the learning sometimes happens between the margins, and it's the conversations you have, it's the way that a more in-depth understanding of topics like tonight's really allows you to approach your curricular choices and the conversations you have with kids in a much more meaningful and different way. As you do so, I do invite you and hope that you find our open education resource platform, the Humanities in Class Digital Library, to be helpful in that pursuit. Again, these materials are free and open. You can trust them as being of the highest quality. You can also trust that you have full permission to use them in a non-commercial way in your teaching. I'm really pleased that the center can create content and make it available through this platform, but I'm equally pleased that, that we're able to create the content from webinars like tonight. Don't forget to use the platform to identify and define the readings that have been provided by our guests, including Professor Farber tonight. These are places that you can organize and associate the learnings in this one central place. And that will include a resource like this one, created by Professor Farber. He's going to talk, I'm sure, a little bit more about this tonight. But these are the kinds of curated primary sources with scholarly annotation that, as an educator, just so incredibly value. valuable. You don't need to go to Google. You don't need to, get what you find online. You can go to a trusted place to find the work that's meaningful and can have highest impact on your teaching. In addition to the National Humanities Center, I'm really pleased that we also have 97 other content providers who have agreed to make some percentage, some scale of their materials available through the digital library. And that does include the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training. Heather Ash has joined us tonight to tell us just a little bit about the materials available at the ATSD, particularly those that apply to tonight's session. Hey, Heather, thanks for joining.
Thank you, Andy. Hi, everyone. I'm the Oral History Program Manager over at ADST, also known as the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training. We're a nonprofit dedicated to strengthening public appreciation of American diplomacy by capturing, preserving, and sharing the experiences of America's diplomats. So our oral history program was started in 1986 and since has collected over 2,500 interviews with former foreign affairs practitioners. A selection of interviews can be found at the Humanities in Class digital library. And I would like to very quickly mention some of our programs. So I already mentioned our oral history program, but it truly is one of the largest of its kind. It contains a wealth of primary source material, and we are always happy to assist with research, any inquiries you might have based on topics that you're looking into. So feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to pull materials related to the topic at hand tonight as well. We also have a publications program. We have several podcast series. We host educational material, including lesson plans, history articles, and we regularly host speaker events. And just quickly, before I hand it back over, I wanted to share an excerpt example related to the topic at hand today. This comes from Yvonne Thayer's oral history. She recounted her experience as the chief narcotics officer for Ecuador and what she did in the 80s for a special government program. She brought an Ecuadorian attorney general to a treatment facility in the Bronx and sort of showed him the situation at hand. And her account shows a firsthand experience of the moment and when the Attorney General sort of changed his view on the effects of the drug trade and started working a little bit more in hand with Yvonne. So I thought that was a cool example to share tonight. But that's all I have. So thank you, and I hope you enjoy the presentation.
Heather, thank you so much for sharing those resources, particularly these from Diplomat Thayer. And I want to thank ATSD for its ongoing relationship and collaboration with the Center. These are wonderful resources, and I hope that everyone in the audience finds not only the ones located in the digital library, but also visit your website to look at the other opportunities you have available. Thank you, Heather.
Thanks.
As I mentioned, we're drawing close to the conclusion of our webinar series this year. We only have 6 episodes left, and I do encourage you to go back to our registration page, take a look at some of our upcoming episodes, and the ones that may seem appropriate and relevant and reasonable for you. Be sure to sign up. Please share these with your colleagues and your departments as well. We will be concluding the sessions by early May, and we would love to maximize our experiences with you. It's likely, though, that you're going to find yourself in May and look at your teaching portfolio and realize you still need some professional development credit, or you just really miss working in this kind of immersive conversational way with leading scholars and experts on different topics. I do encourage you to take a look at our online course catalog. Our summer sessions have been condensed to 1 week in length, and we'll be running them in 3 concurrent sessions starting in June, ending in end of July. We would love to have any of you participate. Please do take a look and let me know if you have questions. Finally, I want to thank our Teacher Advisory Council for their ongoing support and their contributions this year. A second very disrupted year in terms of the pandemic and the ways it's affected all of our teaching. As a matter of fact, I'm going to be welcoming this group to the center tomorrow. They're all flying in. We'll have a 2-day retreat, And you too can come to the center and meet our staff and look under the hood if you apply for and are selected for next year's council. We are accepting applications currently through the end of the month. We would love to have all of you who find our material valuable and our opportunities like something you want to invest yourself in. We really do see this as a mutually beneficial relationship, though. So not only will we ask you to contribute and review and to think about the work we're doing, but we want to do anything we can to amplify your own career interests. Finally, I want to remind you that your participation in the audience chat will be critical for tonight's conversation. As the moderator, I'll be moderating the chat and the Ask the Professor tab. I'll be bringing more formal questions to Professor Farber as time goes on. But please do use both of those functions to interact, to ask for clarifications, and to otherwise participate in tonight's session. So again, you have joined us for the National Humanities Center webinar in class series. Tonight's session is titled The War on Drugs Turns 50. David Farber is our guest tonight. He's a distinguished professor of history at the University of Kansas. I also want to thank Kimberly Rigglesworth for joining us as tonight's TA. Kimberly will be in the chat box, sharing thoughts and resources and otherwise supporting tonight's talk. Hey, Professor, I see you up there in Lawrence, Kansas. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine. Good to be with you.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate you joining here in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. It's raining profusely. Everything is damp and sad, and I'm sure it's bright and sunny there in Lawrence, Kansas after the unfortunate occurrence of last night's basketball game. But as we get started, I'd actually like to reflect just for a moment on what Heather shared in the terms of, and in the sense that, you know, a topic like the war on drugs or the impact of the war on drugs goes far beyond some chronological recitation of events, correct? I mean, there's a political, a diplomatic, a social, a cultural, a historical. I mean, this is a very complicated topic. How in the world do you figure out which of these threads to untangle first?
Oh, thanks for that. I think you're right, Andy. The war on drugs, for me at least, is a lens to looking at the entirety of American history. It really opens up questions of equality, liberty, the fairness of our justice system, and how we see and treat each other. The irony, I think, of the war on drugs, at least that terminology, is ironically, this was a civil war. This was a war of Americans on Americans. And like any civil war, it was full of tragedy.
Yeah, that's such a great way to phrase it, that lens. And, you know, our audience are working with younger people of all ages. And, you know, that lens might need to be refracted or might need to be fine-tuned for different age populations. But ultimately, being able to see it as a lens really does help illuminate certainly the last 25 years. We're really looking forward to your conversation and your talk tonight. As the moderator, I'll be bringing you questions, but I'm going to hand you the keys to the PowerPoint and sit back and enjoy this conversation.
Well, thanks so much, Andy. And thanks to everyone at the NHC for setting this up. And thanks to all of you for coming to listen. Good evening, good afternoon to all of you in LA. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I hope we have a chance to really enter into a conversation about this. You know, it's always dangerous when you get a professor in front of a microphone. We can just carry on and carry on. But please, let's have a conversation with each other. So let me start out by giving you a sense, make this work, there we go, for what I'm going to try to do today, which is kind of give you a quick and hopefully not too dirty an introduction to the war on drugs, make you understand in some ways what I think of as some of the key questions about how we can think about the war on drugs as educators as much as anything. And I think there are two basic ways I'll try to get across what I think is the most critical aspects of that war on drugs. One, just like we all do with our classes, give us the basics. What was it? What was the war on drugs? Who paid the price of the war on drugs? How do we think about the war on drugs as a series of events? Or what are the critical turning points on that war on drugs? So first is to just sort of understand the history of what has been a very tragic part of the American experience. And then secondly, as I indicated in that question and answer I gave to Andy, what should we make of the war on drugs? And in particular, I'd like us to think about the ways in which it affected how we perceive liberty and equality in the United States. So those are sort of the big picture ways I thought we could try to talk about this controversial, provocative subject as we go on. So please, enter into the conversation as I go, and I'll sort of try to get us going by giving us some history and then some of the basic issues. I think one of the things that always surprises people when we start to talk about something like a war on drugs is that this is a historically specific event. Once upon a time, really for most of American history, it's really hard to believe, but there were no laws prescribing the use of intoxicants in this country. The image you've got in front of you right now is an opium den in San Francisco. And opium was perfectly legal in the 18th and 19th centuries. Opium was used as long as there's been the United States. It was widely used in this country. There were no laws restricting it. Same goes for all the other drugs we think of, cocaine, marijuana, and so many others. So it's useful to understand that the United States, a country that often prizes individual liberty, for a very long time did not restrict the use of what are in some ways some very dangerous substances. And one of the things that I always think that kids get a huge kick out of is the degree to which alcohol, still the primary intoxicant in the United States, was ubiquitous in this country, to the degree that critics of the United States, people in England and elsewhere, used to call us the alcoholic republic. And I'm not going to read out loud those statistics, but just think of that. The per capita use of alcohol in the United States was 7.1 gallons. That's some serious liquor usage. And what I always got a kick out of was that people who were doing hard and dangerous work in the United States were paid in part in alcoholic drinks. Can you imagine digging the Erie Canal, working with black powder explosives, and basically drinking 32 ounces of whiskey a day, which was part of your wage? I mean, basically, in other words, everybody was drunk who was digging the Erie Canal, and that was just considered normative behavior in the United States. So intoxication is not exactly a new part of the American experience. The use of powerful intoxicants is as old as this country. And as some of you know, and I hope some of you have seen these kinds of images before, in the 19th century, all the way really up into the early 20th century, substances that we now rightfully think of as very dangerous and risky substances were widely available. That bottle of heroin that you see in the image on the left was widely available on the shelves of pharmacies in the United States. Anyone could get it. It wasn't a prescription drug. It was widely available and it was extremely cheap. Likewise, kids were often given doses of cocaine when they suffered from teething problems or they had a headache or anything thereafter. So what we think of as the most dangerous of drugs were, for the longest of times, easily and readily available in the United States. And they came in all forms. Things that were seen as so-called patent medicines were filled with opioids. The result of this is, as you would expect, there were lots of opium addicts in the United States. There were lots of cocaine fiends in the United States. And most tragically of all, there were babies that died from overdoses of what we now know to be such dangerous drugs. But, you know, I put these on here just to remind you of the ubiquitousness of these kinds of substances in the United States, that there's nothing new about drugs as a problem or drugs as an opportunity or drugs as a consumer choice in the United States. And just before I sort of get off this deep history, yes, it is true that Coca-Cola really did contain cocaine once upon a time. It was a long time ago in which it had an active alkaloid of cocaine in it, but it was really there. And most soft drinks at this time used some tincture of cocaine or even opioids in them. And ironically, the reason was they were seen as temperance beverages. In other words, there was no alcohol in them. These were healthy drinks, safe drinks, good drinks. So it's useful, I think, for us, for teachers, and for students to realize that we make choices, that something even as dangerous as heroin was once upon a time in this country, a legal, easily available substance. It takes a choice to decide to make it illegal, to make it something that you can be arrested for, to make it something that you can go to jail for the rest of your life for selling. So we're going to try to explore some of that history as we go along.
Professor, I've got a couple of questions that might be worth bringing to you at this point.
Sure.
The first question comes from Mike. Mike is in Eastern North Carolina, And he wonders if there's any correlation between alcohol consumption and bad water. Or actually his question was, how did indoor plumbing and various other water treatment technologies change our reliance on alcohol?
Yeah, that's a real good insight. Yeah, it's true. You are more likely to become ill or sick from drinking bad water than you were from drinking a shot or two of whiskey. So many waterborne diseases occurred in the United States at epidemic levels. It's really, not till the 1840s in some big cities and not till the late 19th century that water was regularly seen as sanitary and a healthy substance. So absolutely, some of that use of alcohol it was safer to drink alcoholic beverages than it was to drink the water that ran by your stream or that you got out of your tap in most big cities. That is definitely a piece of it. But also alcohol was seen as a healthy substance. It was seen as providing you strength, it gave you endurance, and it was seen as something that was good for you, not as a problem for much of the 18th and 19th century.
So interesting. One more question before we move on. This comes from Ruth. Ruth is in Baltimore, Maryland. Ruth is wondering if even though these drugs in the forms that you described are legal, were there any legal consequences for doing something when you're intoxicated, like working on the Erie Canal and hurting someone, or having an accident and there being some kind of culpability? Was even if the intoxicants were legal, was there a consequence for being intoxicated?
Yeah, it's a smart question and really goes right to 21st century issues, doesn't it? Is it the intoxicant that's dangerous, or is it the behavior that ensues? In the 19th century, there were almost no laws protecting workers from any kind of behavior. It's useful to remember that. If I got my legal history right, there was what was called the Trinity of Causes, and one of them was, and it's very gendered, if you were a man, the sense was, you should be conscious that you were doing dangerous work and you should pay attention. And if another man was acting in a dangerous fashion, it was up to you as an individual worker to take responsibility for his behavior. So there was almost no worker compensation in the 19th century. There was almost no worker protection laws. So yeah, unfortunately, you could be drunk, light some black powder. This is before dynamite came into the existence, blow up your fellow worker, and yeah, nobody was held responsible. Different times, dangerous times.
Certainly. Thank you.
Yeah, so those questions go right to what I'm going to talk about. And for those of us who teach history, you all know what's coming, which is the progressive era. So it's in the late 19th and early 20th century that we do start to get not a war on drugs, but a regulatory system to begin to attend to some of the dangers of drugs. And you start to see for the first time Americans trying to figure out, should there be rules? Should there be regulations? Should there be prescriptions as to what kind of substances can and cannot be taken? And again, any of you who've ever taught the progressive era know it's a very confusing and confounding era because in some ways such odd bedfellows came together to create these new regulatory structures. And they came from some of the places we would predict. God, in the age of COVID, it's not surprising. Public health officials, for the first time, started to have some authority in the United States. And it's public health professionals who, for the first time, said, I don't think it's a good idea to give little children opioids. It's not a good idea to give teething infants cocaine. These are dangerous substances. And that kind of professional knowledge, that authority, started to make its way felt. Similarly, doctors, suddenly MDs, medical doctors who'd gone to medical school, made some of the same claims. Oh, the reason that people are acting in certain ways is because they are addicted to some of these substances. But as the list here shows, it was a complicated group of people who started to say substances that make you intoxicated, substances that can make you addicted. These are behaviors, these are substances that need to be regulated. I don't know if this is a pop quiz time or not. Does anybody know who that is on the far left, the woman?
Let's make that a pop quiz. Let's pause just for a moment. Let's see if anybody in our audience can type into the chat box, the woman on the far left. Who is that? And Professor, we need to pause just for a second while our voices catch up with their speakers and their speakers with their fingers. Give us a guess. Who do you think that woman on the far left is? Guesses.
It's a tough one.
It's going to come in just a second. Got my money on Andrew. Andrew's going to take a... Carrie Nation, says Jason.
Bingo. They get the prize, whatever that prize is.
Well done, Jason, in Winston-Salem, North Carolina.
Carrie Nation, of course, was famous for carrying around a hatchet, chopping down and chopping up taverns in her attempt to create a temperance movement in the United States. Did a lot of her work here in Kansas, so she's a personal favorite. You can see just the odd mixture of those people. The image on the right, I also think, is pretty humorous. It's not so easy to see, perhaps, but there's basically a pharmacist on the far right who's giving out probably dangerous substances like opioids, and a bartender on the far left, or a tavern keeper, and the tavern keeper is pointing at the pharmacist angrily, in a sense saying, "You're stealing my business, buddy." So this was a time in which muckrakers began to point out some of the dangers, not just of alcohol beverages being sold at taverns, but what could be available at your corner pharmacy as well. This progressive movement, this attempt to start regulating some of the behaviors of Americans, regulating the free market, in a sense, starts to take off at this time. And we start to see a concerted campaign, I think in general, an effective and useful campaign to start thinking about what is the necessary regulations needed to regulate dangerous substances like opioids and perhaps others. And as a prelude, if the war on drugs really takes off in the 1970s, it's useful to see that starting in the early 1900s, a series of laws, essentially laws that regulate and tax more than they criminalize, begin to take effect on things like heroin, opium, cannabis, and of course, most of all, alcohol. And these laws are both local and state, but also increasingly federal laws. The most important, for those of you who are looking for a kind of pointer as to how to teach this, is the 1914 Harrison Narcotics Act. That's the first major act that starts to criminalize at a federal level what we today would think of as the hard narcotics, especially opioids, and to a lesser extent, cocaine. So these series of laws begin to change the atmosphere in which Americans are allowed to become intoxicated. So here again, this is a really interesting question. What's available at the consumer marketplace? What can Americans buy freely? What can they be told they're not allowed to buy? And again, I just think it's wild to think that until really 1900 or so, there were almost no limits on what an American buy. Caveat emptor all the way, buyer beware. It was up to the individual consumer to decide what was and what was not in their own best interest. That begins to change with the progressive age. And while not a war on drugs, this is the beginning of a regulatory regime in which drugs began to become under the auspices of government control. So if from 1900 all the way to 1970, we see a kind of regulatory regime in which there is some punishment for those especially who sell and distribute hard drugs, heroin, cocaine, as well as some others. It's really not until 1970 that we start to see the beginning of what we call in contemporary terms the war on drugs. And that's what we're going to spend the bulk of my time talking to you about tonight. So when we look at the war on drugs, I think it's useful to understand that it's probably not the war on drugs we think of. Its primary target was heroin, and there was good reason for that. By 1970, there was a sense in the United States that drug use, especially among young people, had started to change. It had become more common, it had become more dangerous, and it had become, in some ways, a generational divide. Some of this was quite tragic. Starting in the early 1970s, there was a heroin epidemic in the United States. It was primarily in big East Coast cities. New York and Philadelphia were probably the hardest hit cities, but it extended all the way to Chicago, Kansas City, St. Louis, and others. And that heroin was very powerful, very potent, and was very addictive. And there was indeed a huge change in the supply. Likewise, and some of you probably know this story, there was an incredible upsurge of usage of heroin among our troops in Vietnam. The Golden Triangle, the so-called area near Burma, Laos, and Cambodia, was one of the biggest opium production areas in the world. Heroin was also processed in that part of the world out of opium, and you could buy heroin in that part of the world for as little as 50 cents a vial. It was much cheaper than getting drunk, in other words. And you started to see soldiers in Vietnam using heroin. There was a little bit of a moral panic about this. The heroin use was not quite as widespread as was perceived, but it was real. And that heroin addiction was something that rightfully worried parents, it worried policymakers, and was another feature of that. The third factor of that was, can you put your heads back in this time? This is the 1960s into the 1970s. This was a time of experimentation among young people. And you started to see, although it's really not until the 1970s that this occurs, an uptick in the use of what today we would call softer drugs, in particular marijuana, but also hallucinogenics that started to take off in this period. This had people confounded. They weren't quite sure to do with this. We'd made our peace in some ways by the 1960s with alcohol use. Prohibition had failed. It had been repudiated in 1933. That was the good intoxicant. But these new drugs, and heroin definitely a tragic one, had started to create a sense that Americans no longer had control over the substances in particular that young people were taking. It was also good politics. And Richard Nixon saw statistics like this, and he saw that there had been an upsurge. Richard Nixon, President of the United States, elected in 1968, takes office in 1969, saw that Americans were ever more concerned, in particular, that young people were starting to take drugs in ways that their parents did not know what to do with. And I think this is, can you see the statistics all right? Even as late as 1969, only 4% of Americans at least admitted that they'd used marijuana in their lives. But look at the way it takes off over that next decade or so. So drug use was becoming far more ubiquitous in the United States. This was a moment of truth. What should the United States, if anything, do about this changing, consumer repertoire of intoxications that was going on during this time? This is going to lead to the war on drugs. So Richard Nixon, when he ran for president in 1968, did not talk about drugs. This was not a topic of conversation. This was not something that divided Democrats and Republicans. It really was not on the front burner of American life. But as I say, the heroin problem, the increasing turn to marijuana by young people, started to put this on the political plate. And Nixon, a good politician with his finger in the air, started to sense that something could and should be done about it. I don't know if Richard Nixon still resonates with teachers today, or how you teach Watergate or the scandals of the Nixon administration, but Nixon is an incredibly complicated guy. On the one hand, he was an incredibly pragmatic policymaker, an excellent problem solver. It's Nixon who started the Environmental Protection Agency, for example. It's Nixon who helped pass some of the major environmental laws in the United States. Richard Nixon was probably the first president to take seriously the problem of Native Americans and pass major legislation bringing back rights and land and sovereignty to American Indians. So he's not quite the cliche we might make him out to be. And when it came to drug policy, Nixon, too, is a complicated figure. On the one hand, he was taking advantage of, I guess, what we could call a kind of public panic over young people's turn to drugs, the fears people had about heroin epidemics stretching from Vietnam to big cities in the East. But Nixon really tried to do, in some ways, a responsible kind of response to the war on drugs. June 1971, he got in front of the television cameras. He did declare a kind of war on drugs, but it was a very particular war on drugs. What I think in retrospect was probably a pretty sensible war on drugs. He said the biggest problem we need to face is how to help people who've become addicted to drugs wean themselves away from it. And it's during this time that methadone treatments and other rehabilitatory treatments are created to try to solve the problem, in particular of heroin addiction. And in some ways, this was a pretty sensible public health approach to trying to wean people from what is a deadly, dangerous substance abuse problem. Nixon also had a second spear in that war on drugs. He created the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, and they did what is usually most politically salient. They began to try to take down supply. And as probably all of you know, most drugs in the United States, especially up to the early 1970s, came from other countries. Cannabis came from Mexico, from Colombia. Opioids came from the Middle East, Turkey, as well as from Southeast Asia. So the idea was if you could shut down supply, you could manage the problem the United States' consumer marketplace had created for drug demand. I guess we've been chasing that dragon for the last 50 years, somehow hoping that if we squelch supply, demand will take care of itself. We've yet to figure that out. Just as a quick aside, one of the ironies of Operation Intercept, which began to target Mexican marijuana, was the creation of a domestic marijuana market here in the United States. I notice a number of you are from Los Angeles. If you went up to Humboldt County, which is a pretty good drive, that's when the marijuana business began to take off in Northern California, once it became difficult to bring in marijuana, which is bulky and heavy and smelly, from Mexico. This campaign to start to interdict drugs targeted a group that we might not suspect today. It was primarily whites. It was primarily people who were bringing in marijuana and hallucinogenics. It was not the war on drugs that we're going to soon see. So these criminals were often countercultural figures. The Brotherhood of Eternal Love brought in hundreds of thousands of pounds of hashish and other high-potency cannabis. They also were the major distributors of LSD in the United States, most famously producing something called Orange Sunshine, which they produced in the amount of millions of doses of LSD. They were arrested and they were brought down, and that ring was destroyed. As some of you might suspect, that had almost no impact on the supply of drugs in the United States. That's going to be a continuing problem. Major busts occur, people are arrested, but like squeezing a balloon, the drug supply just emerges somewhere else. And that was the experience in the early 1970s as well. So this is sort of the first phase in the war on drugs. And it was controversial. And it was controversial, I think, for reasons that will probably be obvious to many of you. I don't know how well you can see that face. I'm sorry, that was the best image I could get. But every one of those figures in the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, as I mentioned before, is white. They're all white men. And indeed, many of the people who were involved in cannabis were whites, often young white men and women. That became somewhat unpopular as you started to see young whites being arrested in the war on drugs. And there was, during this time, a real question of who should be targeted in the war on drugs. Should it be marijuana, which was by far the most widely used illegal drug in the United States at that time? Or should it be the hard drugs that Nixon began his war on drugs fighting, heroin in particular? Politicians, not surprisingly, got into this game in a very big way. I don't know if any of you recognize that happy, smiling fellow on the right. That's Governor Nelson Rockefeller from New York. To use a kind of oxymoronic term that doesn't really make sense in the 21st century, he was a liberal Republican. That's right, there used to be such things, a liberal Republican. But Rocky, who had aspirations to become the president of the United States, he was hoping to run for presidency in 1976, decided that drugs were the issue that were going to get him into public acclaim. And he, more than anyone else in the United States, produced a series of draconian drug policies, as that headline shows, that began to greatly up the punishment for those who were found distributing drugs in the United States. But he was targeting, as Nixon had done, hard drug pushers, in particular heroin. Remember, it's New York that has a fierce heroin problem during this period of time. So drugs which are being treated at the national level also become a political football at the state and local level. Who's going to be arrested? Who's going to be targeted? These all became really powerful political questions. And as you see, things start to change at this point. I mean, one of the things I really found surprising when I did my own research on this is, look at that number in 1973. There were only 843 people in prison in New York on felony drug charges. I don't know if we have anybody from Chicago with us today, but in Chicago in the 1970s, there were usually less than 100 prisoners in state prisons, in Illinois prisons, for drug charges. The cops, the police departments, state law enforcement were just not that interested in the early 70s in putting people into prison on drug charges. But as you can see, this starts to change dramatically as the years go by. I mean, that's an order of magnitude change between 1973 and 1992. And what happened in New York also happens in California, where a certain governor named Reagan, who steps down, in 1974, had also declared a war on drugs during this period of time. Also, as you start to see the statistic at the bottom, who's getting arrested for drugs is starting to change from something that was at least somewhat divided between white, black, and Latino prisoners becomes increasingly people of color who are going to be in prison for drug charges.
Professor, before we move on, I wonder if I'm going to go back to that last slide, and I'm going to ask you a clarifying question. This comes from Allison, who is in Huntington, West Virginia. She's wondering if, and I'm going to paraphrase this, Allison, please drop something in the chat if I mangle this. She's wondering how in the early 1970s, as both at the federal and the state and the local levels, politicians began to turn their attention to this problem with drugs. She's wondering what the metrics of problem really means. So, of course, if you have a law and somebody breaks that law, as the stats on the screen indicate, then you've got people committing crime, fine. But were there other metrics for what makes at what point did it cusp to be a problem? Was it people falling out of jobs? Was it people, hospitalized? Was it people having accidents? Like how did they decide that this was a problem, even if individual people were using drugs at a high level?
That's a great question, and really goes to one of the complications of a so-called war on drugs. So again, I can't say this enough. By far the most widely used drug in the United States in the 1970s, and still true today, is marijuana or cannabis products. And one of the problems police in particular had was there was no underlying criminal behavior associated in particular with cannabis use, other than the fact that it was illegal to possess or sell cannabis. So yes, you are not seeing corollary problems. That's not true with heroin. So with heroin addicts, the problem is because it's illegal, because it's relatively expensive, because heroin addicts need a continuous supply of the drug, they commit crimes in order to support their drug habit. So
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Yeah. So you start to see a real change. So that is one of the complexities, and it goes to the next slide that I'm going to show you, which is the decriminalization battles. So the question that was just asked was being asked by Americans. Have we created laws that are creating more problems than the underlying drug substance itself? And we kind of know where we're going to get in 2022, right, with marijuana. So this was being debated already in the 1970s. By imprisoning young people for possessing or even selling cannabis, are we creating more damage than the drug itself? President Jimmy Carter believed that to be the case. So we had a president of the United States way back when who believed that we should, at a minimum, decriminalize marijuana. So decriminalize is not the same as make legal. Decriminalize meant probably to create penalties for smoking marijuana in public or things like that. That would be equivalent of getting a parking ticket. You could pay a fine, in other words, if you committed certain kinds of drug crimes, but you wouldn't go to prison. You wouldn't go to jail. And this was a fairly popular move at this time. And an organization called NORML, the National Organization to Reform Marijuana Laws, became quite popular. So again, I want to go back to what I said all the way at the beginning of this talk. The war on drugs is a kind of civil war. And it's Americans fighting Americans. And in the 1970s in particular, you're starting to see Americans debate this question. Have we gone too far? Are we penalizing people? Are we criminalizing substances? Are we destroying lives in ways that fundamentally doesn't make sense. We're hurting each other rather than helping each other through a hard time. This came really close, and there were a number of states that would have begun to decriminalize marijuana during this period of time. But things changed quickly enough. And one of the ways it changed, and I think all of us who are teachers can probably respond to this, while marijuana is not a dangerous drug in the sense that it can cause addiction, it could cause you to overdose, it could kill you, we all know that there are problems when 14-year-olds and 16-year-olds start getting stoned every day. And parents and teachers noticed this problem in the 1970s. Can you remember that slide I showed a while ago where only 4% of people said that they'd smoked marijuana in 1969? By the time you get to the late 1970s, it's about 24%, and that is disproportionately young people, teenagers and people in their 20s. The result of that was a lot of parents started to become very upset. And a parents' movement grew throughout the United States. It actually started in Atlanta, Georgia, and it quickly spread throughout the United States. Of parents who said, all this talk of decriminalization, all this talk that marijuana is harmless, that's not what I'm seeing with little Jane and Johnny. They're doing poorly in school, they're getting high, I don't want to see them driving while they're intoxicated, no matter what substance they're using. There were dangers associated, and they were right to see them with marijuana, not just with heroin or other hard drugs. Once again, not surprisingly, this became a political question in the United States. And candidate Reagan, when he ran in 1980, took off from what he had done as governor of California back in 1966 to 1974. He made drugs a political issue during the campaign. He said specifically that Jimmy Carter, remember he runs against Jimmy Carter in 1980, was, and here's a phrase that will echo through the decades, was soft on drugs. And this became a major political campaign issue during this time. It's hard to know what would have happened in this debate, this civil war over drug use, if something hadn't changed rather dramatically during this period of time. And before I go further on, I guess worth pointing out that the Reagan administration embraced drug education as well as supply interdiction. The DARE program, is that still around in schools today? Some of you teachers must know this. Became extremely popular in the 1980s and 90s. I think it's still around. Nancy Reagan famously started the Just Say No campaign. This became a kind of laugh line. I noticed somebody else in the chat had talked about Saturday Night Live, and believe me, Nancy Reagan came under quite a bit of ridicule for her Just Say No campaign. It actually was quite popular. There were thousands and thousands of Just Say No clubs in the 1980s into the 1990s in schools, and it probably had some impact on reducing the amount of marijuana smoked by teenagers. So I got to give Nancy Reagan at least two cheers for her campaign. But what really started to change in the 1980s, and it changed the both political calculus and the racial calculus of the war on drugs, was the turn to a very different kind of drug, which was crack cocaine. I'm not going to go into it in too much detail. For those of you who want to know more, please feel free to buy my book, Crack. Came out about 2 years ago. But crack cocaine was really, in some ways, a new substance. I don't want to get into too much. I got in legal trouble because I was going to put a recipe for how to make crack in my book on crack cocaine and was told by the publisher that was not the best idea I ever had in my life. It's fairly easy to make. I'll leave it to you to look up on Google on how it might be done. But crack cocaine became a very cheap and efficient way to sell cocaine, powder cocaine, in a new form to poor people in particular. You could buy a vial of crack cocaine for around $3 to $7 in most areas of the United States by the mid-1980s. And crack cocaine had a very powerful intoxicating effect very quickly on people. It was a drug mainly taken up by the poor, although middle-class people used it as well. And it became disproportionately a drug used in poor communities, particularly poor Black communities. I think a lot of white people feared that their kids, their teenagers, would move from marijuana, again, relatively harmless, I stress relatively, to the far more dangerous usage of crack cocaine. And this started to change the drug dynamic in the United States. Crack cocaine became, again, just an incredible political tool in the United States as Americans wrestled with, again, this fundamental question of liberty. What was it okay for Americans to buy and sell? Crack seemed to be beyond the pale. It seemed too dangerous too quickly. And laws were passed quickly to mandate massive federal penalties. Many of you probably know this. Cocaine as a powder substance and crack cocaine are pharmacologically the exact same substance. They are not particularly more dangerous one or the other, though it is true that crack cocaine has a far more immediate intoxicating effect than powder cocaine. But politicians, in an attempt again to kind of sort of win political favor with a very anxious public, as they saw this new drug percolating through American society, created these incredibly draconian penalties. So as you see here, if you had 5 grams of crack cocaine, you faced a mandatory minimum prison sentence of 5 years in jail. I don't know, can anybody picture 5 grams of crack? Hopefully nobody's going to volunteer yes on that question. But 5 grams of crack is about as much as a quarter, a 25-cent piece. So it's a very small amount of drugs, and you could end up going to jail for a very long time. This is when you started to see a massive racial disparity in the war on drugs. And under the Reagan administration, what happened under the Nixon administration became totally transformed. So can you remember what I said about the Nixon administration's so-called good war on drugs? Overwhelmingly, the money being spent was built on rehabilitation and education. If you look at this chart here, you'll see that about 85% of all federal drug money is now going to be spent on enforcement, which is to say, putting people in prison. And this is the beginning of what some have called the carceral state, or massive increase in the amount of people who are going to go to prison in the United States. And that number of people overwhelmingly tend to be African American. Yeah, I see here somebody said White Line song of the 1980s. That's right. For those of you interested, also in my crack book, I have a playlist, and White Lines is one of those songs. So, again, these are really hard questions. Crack cocaine was dangerous. Crack cocaine was having a devastating effect on poor Americans. The amount of foster children doubled during the crack epidemic, which basically lasted from the mid-'80s to the mid-1990s. The amount of homicides that took place in poor Black communities also increased by almost 50% as drug gangs fought over drug territory during this period of time. So I don't want to underestimate the degree to which something like crack cocaine, or for that matter heroin, are very dangerous substances that can lead to destruction of individual lives and communities as well. These are not simple stories. But the response that Americans had in the 1980s and would continue for the next 20 years to have was to turn what was arguably a very dangerous public health problem. People were turning to dangerous drugs to get through their days, who were turning to dangerous drugs like heroin and cocaine to figure out how to get past the miseries of their everyday lives, was producing an incredibly punishing regime by state governments, local governments, and the federal government. And this produced what has become the highest number of incarcerated people in the history of the United States. And indeed, the United States becomes the largest incarcerator of citizens of any country in the world during this period of time. This, I think, is the war on drugs we tend to think of. And its punishing aspects cannot be underestimated. So these statistics here, I think, are just, it's a great slide and it's worth reckoning. Look at those numbers of increase in the number of people in prison. This is essentially taking off from the crack epidemic of the 1980s, but it's swooping up other people, heroin users at this point by the late 80s and 90s of methamphetamines, and cannabis users as well. Almost 30 million Americans will be arrested during the war on drugs. Now, many of those people do not go to prison. Many of them are picked up for possession of cannabis, and they don't end up going to prison for that charge. But it is worth understanding the kind of grand sweeps that took place during this era as Americans' lives were disrupted. And remember, even if you ended up not going to prison, but you received a felony charge for, let's say, cannabis possession, your life was changed forever. You became ineligible for federal grants for education. It was harder to get a job. The devastation was just clear and pressing. And this is something we decided to do to ourselves. One of the other aspects of this that I think is still telling today, and we're still living with this, is when you make a substance that has a massive demand associated with it illegal, you tend to create a huge profit margin associated with it. When you create a huge profit margin associated with the sale or distribution of a substance, you create fierce competition for the right to sell it and the territory in which to do so. So, not surprisingly, during Prohibition and then during this crack cocaine era, you see the highest number of homicides that the United States has ever suffered through. You've just made it too worthwhile to do something illegal, and people are going to kill each other to maintain those territories. Unfortunately, we're seeing some of that still today. If the war on drugs is a kind of devastating force in American lives, there was a kind of silver lining to this. One of the things that happened in particular with crack cocaine, for example, is if you were a 16-year-old or an 18-year-old and you're watching people become lost to the use of crack cocaine, you are probably going to say to yourself, this is not the best way to get intoxicated. So you started to see, starting in the mid-1990s, a lot of people saying, this drug is too dangerous. This drug is too devastating. And you started to see a diminution of the use of crack cocaine. Again, for those of you who live in LA or those of you who live in other big cities, it's not as if crack cocaine has disappeared. It's still relatively easy to buy. But its massive use did start to dissipate. And the result of that was actually a massive turn toward higher quality cannabis. And the cannabis we see today starts to take off in the 1990s. So the question became, as cannabis became a substitute and high intensity cannabis, in other words, cannabis that has a large percentage of the potent force, which is THC in it, you started to get a question of, should the United States turn its attention toward imprisoning people who are now using high potency marijuana? And that's when the war on drugs started to wane. I think part of that was because many of the people who sold marijuana were white, to be very frank. And once again, as in the 1970s, the decision to start arresting tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of white Americans seemed to be something that the white majority did not think was useful. In addition, there was something else that happened, and it happened in Los Angeles and in San Francisco and throughout much of California, was there was a movement to start thinking again about something that had happened all the way back in the 1890s. Was there a reason some of these drugs should be used by Americans? Were opioids, cannabis, cocaine, hallucinogenics really purely evil? And the precipitating agent for some of that occurred in the 1980s and into the early 1990s with cannabis and the problem of AIDS. I don't know how many of you are old enough to have lived through the AIDS epidemic and its most tragic aspects, but there was no answer at that point for AIDS. There was no medication sufficient to stop its symptoms or to slow down the disease. And as a result, people were becoming very sick very quickly. And one of the, it's almost like a tragicomedy. One of the things that was discovered was one of the reasons that people became very sick from AIDS, besides getting cancers and other opportunistic diseases, was that they found it very difficult to eat. They became highly nauseous. They threw up. They had emetic qualities. And marijuana, it's like a joke, right? You smoke marijuana, you want to go buy a bag of Doritos. Well, it's true. Marijuana has the effect of increasing people's ability to eat and to take in calories. And people on AIDS discovered that if they smoked marijuana, they could get more calories. They could get more nutrition. They could eat more efficiently. And there was an attempt to start using medical marijuana as a tool to help people who were sick with AIDS. This started to change the dynamic by which marijuana is perceived. Was marijuana simply a recreational intoxicant? Or was it, as some people had already used it for a century or more, also a medicine. And there was an attempt to start to educate Americans to the fact that marijuana in particular has a number of medicinal qualities to it. That list seems to still be growing even into the 21st century. So if marijuana, the most popular drug, had some attendant uses, what did that tell us about the war on drugs? And as this slide indicates, in California at least, arguably the most progressive state in the United States when it comes to questions at least of cultural issues, the decision was made to start creating medical marijuana. Today, of course, as many of you know, I can't tell you this personally from the state of Kansas, but as many of you know, marijuana has become an exceptional substance, or cannabis exceptionalism has become the rule, not the exception in the United States. A drug that's still by the federal government considered a high category substance 1 drug, which is to say under federal law, marijuana is still treated as dangerous as heroin or other opioids throughout the United States. That kind of conventional wisdom has started to change. Once you start to get exceptions to the war on drugs, the whole logic of the enterprise begins to change. What is it about consumption? What kind of liberties should Americans have when it comes to buying things that they think are useful or recreational, or in some ways not as dangerous as some have argued? And we started to see this fundamental change really in our century, though it begins in California in 1996. This has started to change the logic of the war on drugs. And for those of you who are working with young people, we all know that this is a tricky business. Drugs are still dangerous. Drugs are still not something that young people who have growing brains and changing consciousness can readily adapt themselves to, but we're still trying to figure out the limits on these issues. And we're doing this at the time when big pharma, pharmaceutical companies, are also pushing the boundaries of what is acceptable and unacceptable drug behavior. So I'm going to leave you with sort of just some fundamental questions about how we decide what's right and what's wrong when it comes to drugs in the United States. First of all, we know fundamentally this is a political question. I think that's what I want to emphasize. This has changed over time. It has a great deal to do with our perceptions as much as with the scientific evidence that's available. And it has a lot to do with, to be frank, where money is to be made. So as we look at the opioid crisis, we know that this was a crisis that was created within the legal system. It was something that was done through pharmaceutical endeavors. The pusher in this case was often the CVS or the Walgreens. Not that I'm singling them out as having done anything wrong. It's just that this was something that we did under illegal auspices that then took off and became the worst epidemic of drugs we've ever had in our country. Far more people have been killed who started off with legal opioids than were killed by all other illegal drugs combined in the United States. So finally, as we sort of reaching the end of this story, those of you who are following this know that there is a whole series of attempts to try to figure out how we move 51 years after Nixon's speech to reducing a war on drugs to something very different. Can we move to decriminalization, as people argued in the 1970s? Should we move to legalization, as began in California in the 1990s? Can we take even the worst and most dangerous of drugs, let's say heroin, and figure out how to treat it not as a criminal problem, but as a public health problem, in which we can use harm reduction techniques like using methadone or needle exchanges or putting people into treatment to try to create not a war on drugs, but an attempt to assuage dangerous public health problems in a new fashion. I think there's a new consensus in the United States that the war on drugs was a failure, that putting so many people in prison destroyed far more lives than drugs ever would have done by themselves. But I think we're still at the point in the 21st century where we don't have certain answers yet to this problem. And I think this will be a question all of us will keep asking in the days ahead. Thanks. I hope we have some questions and we can keep talking about this stuff. Thank you all.
We do very much. Thank you so much, Professor. And we do have questions that have come in. I'm going to remind the audience that we would love to have more questions submitted formally in the Ask the Professor tab. Please take a moment to share any question that you'd like us to address. So I'm going to do these in, I don't know, somewhat of a thematic order, I think. And I'd actually like to start with a question that's come in from Ben. Ben is in Spokane, Washington. He's wondering if you can talk some about uh, the sense of perception that you've talked a lot about, certainly in the the last 3 decades of the 20th century. The perception of drugs as an evil agent, the perception of drugs as a problem, and whether it's personal or societal. He's wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role of media and art in that perception. How did movies, film, music, certainly, as well as propaganda in politics, how did that either shift or respond to the perceptions that you've described?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the side, I didn't talk about too much today, which is a side I'd like to talk about usually, is I keep saying this is in some ways a civil war. And it's useful to remember that during this entire war on drugs, tens of millions of Americans were using illegal substances. This is not, a tiny problem or a tiny marketplace. And there were lots of Americans who thought there was nothing wrong with snorting cocaine, smoking marijuana, or using other illegal substances. And that's reflected in our music, that's reflected in our art, that's reflected in our films. And I think in particular, movies and television shows, I think played a role in starting to change people's consciousness, in particular about cannabis, where it became more of a comedic aspect. People who were high were seen as funny, not dangerous. People who were high were seen as stoners, not criminals. And while, again, I want to stress that I'm not somebody who's advocating that teenagers do well by smoking marijuana. I don't think it's wise. I do think that treating them as criminals or treating this as a danger has not been good for our society. And we've had that counter narrative, that counter dialogue all along. I think we've had some of that with other drugs. I mean, I think somebody in one of the chats talked about all the music. Think about all the hip hop songs that speak to the drug business and valorize it. Make heroes in some ways out of these drug dealers. Not always a good idea. It's very problematic. But it's, again, a reminder that for different factions of American society, through culture, through art, the drug experience and the drug business have not been treated as some sort of malign evil that deserves incarceration and fury.
That's a great point. Thank you. This next question comes from Mark. Mark is in Clark County, Nevada, which is, I believe, right outside of Las Vegas. Mark is wondering if you can talk some about the school-to-prison pipeline. I mean, you've alluded certainly to mass incarceration. I dropped a link in the chat box of a recording of a previous webinar we've done with Heather Thompson from University of Michigan, who talks very eloquently and passionately about mass incarceration. But talk to us a little bit about the role of drug laws and the war on drugs in that school-to-prison pipeline where young people are criminalized and then can't get out of the system.
Yeah, I think one of the tragedies of the war on drugs is that we created a kind of zero tolerance approach to drugs in which punishment, not education, not treatment, were seen as the primary tool through which we could solve what is a complicated problem. And the idea that we're going to take 14 and 16-year-olds who got caught with a marijuana cigarette or two or even a few pills and destroy their lives essentially by putting a felony on them and putting them in prison or a juvenile facility. Again, I think in retrospect, we're going to look back at this period and think, what the hell were we thinking? And to turn difficult social problems into problems of incarceration and punishment, did not do well by our young people.
Absolutely. And Andrew, who's joining us from Southern California, asks, I think earnestly, although even the phrasing of the question, I think maybe implies where he stands on this question, but he's wondering if there's even the slightest possibility of deprivatizing these prison systems. That's such a big part of mass incarceration, the fact that prisons are oftentimes private and making money off of the number of souls that they have. Do you see any change coming in terms of if drugs are made either decriminalized or more legal, that it will affect the way that the prison system is run?
we have finally not just bent the curve, but have brought the curve downward on incarceration in the United States. And I think people have come to see that we've created perverse incentives in our system for incarcerating people. One of those perverse incentives was turning prisons into a profit center. And anytime you incentivize something with money, you're going to get more of it. And so I think creating private prison systems, again, in retrospect, was a bad idea. I think the hope was somehow you could save money, that the free market would be more efficient than public governance systems. That's not a stupid idea. That's a reasonable system, reasonable thought. You create competition, maybe you can lower prices and costs. But again, all it did was incentivize. And so you created lobbies for creating more prisons and lobbies for creating longer prison systems. And once again, that's not going to produce good public policy.
Certainly. And maybe to put a final and finer point on this, this next question comes from Armin. Armin's also in Los Angeles and wonders, I'm going to share the question. I'm not sure if I know the details she's alluding to. And if you don't, Professor, then I might ask her to add back in the chat box some more specifics. But she's wondering if, in your opinion, the reforms that are happening currently in New York State about marijuana will help reshape the system and the incarceration of people of color.
I think that's absolutely the hope. And this goes to the ways in which, alas, sometimes our criminal justice system worked. And I alluded to it, but didn't go into it in detail with the crack cocaine crisis. In general, poorer people tend to be easier to round up and to criminalize. They're living in public more. They have less resources when it comes to being arrested and fighting those charges. And so disproportionately poor people are those who are arrested. Disproportionately poor people are people of color. Disproportionately, we have some racial injustices in our criminal court systems. And so drug charges became an easy and simple way to put felony jackets on way too many people of color. And once you have that felony jacket on you, it's harder to get legitimate work. That pushes you further into the criminal world. And again, all hell breaks loose. That's what we've been living with for 50 years. And that's part of the tragedy of contemporary life. Yes, what's happening in New York City. Yes, what's happening in California. Yes, what's happening in a lot of places around the country as we decriminalize drug charges, I think is going to have a good impact on the racial injustice of the criminal justice system more broadly.
And do you mind just summarizing briefly what is happening in New York that we're talking about?
Well, there's two things happening. One is cannabis is now widely available, and there's an attempt in New York City to also provide people who've been adversely affected by the drug system to now take advantage of the profit-making opportunities that are legal in the drug system, cannabis in particular right now, and to give them advantages in the licensing procedures. This has also happened in parts of California and elsewhere in the United States.
Yeah, thank you. Here's the next question. This one comes from, I'm going to take this in a slightly different direction. By the way, I see many questions rolling in. I really do appreciate all of your contributions to the audience, and we'll do our best to get through all of these in the time remaining. This next question comes from Abigail. Abigail is wondering if you can associate and connect the role of the war on drugs on the creation of our war on terror. Can you tie those two so-called wars in any way?
Oh, that's an interesting question. The only way I can really come at that, I'm not an expert on some of this though, is in Afghanistan. So in Afghanistan, of course, was the primary area most recently for opioids. They grow the opium plant there, as well as in Mexico and other places. And the war on terror became, in part, on the other side, the Taliban was funded in part through opium production. And our entire relationship with the production of opium has constantly figured in the politics of that region and has further complicated it. So in that sense, the war on terror and the war on drugs, especially in Afghanistan, have been conflated and mixed together in ways that have not boded well. There's some great work by a guy named James Bradford who's written about this. Not my area of expertise. This guy really knows his stuff on that.
Fantastic, thank you. That really is an interesting connection. Next question, and this is maybe this might be something that we can rely on the Google machine to help us with. But Carolyn's in New Hampshire. Hey, Carolyn, thanks so much for your recent email and the help that you gave us. Carolyn's wondering, generally speaking, what percentage of incarcerated people have been users versus dealers? And is there in the eyes of the law or in the eyes of the lens that through the lens that you're sharing with us tonight, is there a difference between the user and the dealer?
In terms of punishment, there is a major difference. So very few people in the United States for a very long time, for example, have gone to prison, I stress prison, for marijuana possession. They've gone to jail sometimes overnight, a couple nights, things like that, but they don't go to prison. However, and this goes back to the racialization of the war on drugs. A lot of times what happens with people is if they're caught with a small amount of drugs, they can be charged with possession with the intent to distribute. So they're not just charged with possession. They can, even though they're not caught selling, they can be charged with that, and that's a felony. And they can go to prison. And that's often at the discretion of the law enforcement officials who caught the people and then district attorney's offices and others. And we've got study after study that shows, in particular, that African Americans who are caught with small amounts of drugs are often charged with possession with the intent to distribute rather than just possession. So again, this is one of those, is it unconscious racism or unconscious bias? It's not 100% clear, but we do know the numbers. And so that's how you tend to get in prison, even though you have a relatively small amount of drugs, possession with the intent to distribute.
Great, thank you. John, who's down in Jupiter, Florida, South Florida on the ocean side, has a question. John is wondering if you can talk a little bit about the role of insurance companies in the war on drugs. Was there any kind of role, whether it's through lobby efforts or through the industry itself, to criminalize or not, or maybe decriminalize drug use, particularly when it pertains to things that might happen under that influence?
That's a cool question. The only angle I got on that is my neighbor state, Colorado. I know this to be the fact that when Colorado began the process of making cannabis legal, one of the concerns people had, and this does relate to the auto insurance industry, was it was going to be harder to catch people who were intoxicated on cannabis than it is on alcohol. We have really good tests. It's really easy to catch people, like if they're drunk driving. It's harder to do driving while stoned. And insurance companies were really worried about that because it'd be harder to prove that somebody, was liable for an accident because they were intoxicated on cannabis. That's the only angle I got. That's a really cool question. I don't have much more to give to that.
Yeah, thank you. And similarly, kind of looking at the industry response or impact, the push and pull of different industries. I wonder if you can speak at all to what Emily has asked. Emily is in Oakland, California, and she's curious about the bureaucracy and the legal challenges of having a legal marijuana dispensary. Meaning, is that also a form of racism whereby poor, undereducated folks who may want to start and kind of engage in this business can't do so because they can't navigate the complex government system that's required to have permits and business licenses and down payments in the bank and all these kinds of things. Are you seeing in your work any kind of sort of secondary layer of racism around the legalization of marijuana?
Yeah, that's a big question that's occurring right now all over the United States as legalization is proceeding through the states. So, it's so complicated because there still are federal laws against cannabis. So the whole banking system, the whole finance system, the whole capitalization of this new industry is totally crazy right now. So you're absolutely right. The only way you can really start one of these dispensaries, or at least in a big way start one, or a grow house, is to have alternative forms of capitalization that tends to reward moneyed people. Moneyed people disproportionately tend to be white. And so there is a kind of racial component there. So again, it's not it's not a deliberate racist policy to exclude Black or Latinos from the drug industry, but because of the structure of society, they tend to be precluded from participating at an equitable level, even as they were the people who were disproportionately punished for having been caught in the drug system. So yeah, a lot of people are thinking and working on this right now. It's still not been solved. Even as I said, there are set-asides in some drug legalization statutes to ensure that those who have either suffered directly, in other words, they've been imprisoned for cannabis charges, or who are people of color and have been seemingly locked out of the business. So people are aware of this, but yeah, it has not been solved.
Yeah, thank you. And this brings up a question from Jake. Jake is with his sister Sasha in Richmond, Virginia, and he's wondering if you can comment on just the pure number of individuals who are still incarcerated for a crime that is now legal in 12 states. What's happening with folks who, unfortunately, a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years, 20 years ago, were put in the federal penitentiary because of things, marijuana in particular, that's now legal. Is there any kind of restitution for those individuals?
Yeah, remember what's so crazy. So at the federal level, and relatively few people are in federal penitentiaries. Yeah, there's no relief right now for anybody who's been charged with cannabis crimes, right? Because it's still a federal crime. Now, at the state level, there has been a fair amount of people who have been emancipated from prison on cannabis charges. It's not been complete. It depends on the specifics of the charge. But often when the statutes are passed, and it has to be statutes that legalize marijuana, and not just medical marijuana, but recreational marijuana, there have been broad releases of people for cannabis charges. But I don't have the number of how many are still in prison over those charges.
Yeah, thank you. This next question comes from Jason. You may recall Jason was the participant who identified Carrie Nation first. Again, Jason is in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And this is a little bit of a longer question, but I'd love to get your response to it. He's wondering if you can, how much stock you put in the following quote by John Ehrlichman regarding Nixon's war on drugs. He said, "You want to know what this war on drugs was really all about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people." You understand what I'm saying? So he's wondering if, actually, I'm sorry, the quote continues. "We knew that we couldn't make it illegal to be either against or go to war with Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news." What do you make of that quote from John Ehrlichman?
Yeah. So that's a quote you see all the time. Journalists use that a lot. I do not think that is a true statement. I think Ehrlichman, who suffered tremendously from bitter grapes, he was extremely bitter. Remember, he went to prison for Watergate charges, came to hate Nixon. I don't think it accurately reflects what Nixon actually thought. That's not necessarily right. I could be wrong, but there's also no archival records. There's no proof that Nixon ever said or thought those things. So it's kind of up in the air. You will see that all over the place, though. And I personally have not found that substantiated by any evidence I've ever seen.
Thank you for that clarification. Just a couple more questions with the time we have remaining. This next question comes from Monica. Monica's in nearby Durham, North Carolina. She's wondering if you can comment at all on the global war on drugs. How did other similar countries handle these same issues in the same time period? Great Britain, France, Italy, Spain, etc. How did other countries approach this, or was this a uniquely American event?
So in terms of our peer countries, the United States put heavy pressure on other countries to follow our lead on the war on drugs. So we actually tied aid, we tied policy to other countries signing what was called the Single Convention on Drugs. They had to follow an international convention on drug policy in order to get certain aid and support from us. So you saw a lot of similar relationships. However, no one ever incarcerated people on drugs among our peer nations the way we did. And most European countries very quickly backed off the fiercely punitive war on drugs that we pursued. Famously, even countries that seemingly were more conservative, like Portugal and Spain, changed their policies dramatically well before us. There are countries even more fierce than us, countries like the Philippines, for example, but that's a whole other can of worms. Our peer nations have tended to turn away from the war on drugs more quickly than we ever did.
Thank you. Last question, Professor. I'm actually going to bring it forward myself, and I mean this question very, very genuinely. Based on your work, the research that you've done, the presentation tonight, Professor, are you optimistic?
I am optimistic in general that we're starting to treat drug problems as a public health problem and as something that deserves sympathy and empathy rather than cruelty and punishment. I do want to emphasize, though, that this is not an easy subject. Methamphetamine is a very dangerous drug that's spreading rapidly. The opioid epidemic shows us how dangerous drug addiction can be. I don't want anyone to ever think that there's simple answers to this problem, but I think we're starting to see that we can more broadly use a public health perspective to get better answers to what is a human predicament. People, for whatever the reason, like to get high, and we have to figure out what to do about it.
Professor Farber, thank you so much for leading this conversation tonight. We look forward to your continued work, and I hope that you keep in touch. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
I want to thank everybody in the audience tonight for joining us for this webinar. Please do follow the National Humanities Center and our social media feeds for upcoming opportunities. In fact, we have a couple of announcements that will be breaking soon about summer programming that we would love for some of you to consider attending. I also hope to see you at our next webinar. In fact, it'll be April the 12th. This is 6 of 6 more to go. We're in the tail end of our season. I'll be joined by Elsa Wee. Elsa is at the African Studies Center at Boston University, and she'll be sharing her work on teaching languages archive, Creole and colonialism in Mauritania. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day at school tomorrow. If you've got spring break coming up, I hope you enjoy it. We'll see you next time in the Humanities in Class webinar series. Good night, everyone.
If I should choose to make a part of me, the truest strike me dead.